Access to GP appointments.
I beg to move that this House do now adjourn.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. Patrick Grady.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I suppose I ought to begin by wishing my honourable friend for Glasgow South West a very happy birthday, based on what he was saying about the birthday present he's just received. Topical questions, Madam Deputy Speaker, as you often remind us, as do other occupants of the chair, are supposed to be short and to the point. But having been unsuccessful in catching Mr Speaker's eye during FCDO questions topicals last week and following my point of order later that day, he's kindly granted this adjournment debate to explore what would otherwise have been a very short topical question: where is the Foreign Secretary and why is he not answering questions in this House? But now we have the opportunity to explore that in a little bit more detail, and I'm very grateful to Mr Speaker for that. But we might as well acknowledge at the start that even though we have, in fact, even more time than might have been expected to explore the issue, I suspect that the response from the Government is going to be relatively short, and the Minister is simply going to suggest that the House must wait patiently for it to publish its response to the Procedure Committee's recent report on this issue in the usual timescale. But that doesn't change the reality, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the appointment of David Cameron as the Foreign Secretary in the House of Lords has had both immediate and practical consequences for members of this House, and it raises wider questions about the relationship between the two houses, the accountability of ministers more generally, and about the kind of precedent his appointment has set. And the Government should be prepared to answer those kind of questions at any time. Certainly, it should have thought some of these things through before that appointment was made. If it is going to smash up conventions in appointing a Foreign Secretary from the Lords, then it shouldn't have to hide behind conventions about timescales for responding to Select Committee reports before trying to justify that decision and deal with its consequences. So there are, as I say, two interlinked themes that I think it's worth exploring. Firstly, some of the practical implications and consequences relating specifically to the current Foreign Secretary being a member of the House of Lords, but also to the wider principles involved about how ministers, especially those who sit in the Lords, are scrutinised by the elected House. I'm very happy to give way.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I commend the honourable gentleman for Glasgow North for bringing this forward? I spoke to him beforehand, and I well understand the issues that he's bringing to the House. There is a clear disconnect between the essence of elected Democrats and the scrutiny of Secretaries of State who sit in Cabinet and moreover the electorate. Does the member not agree that to tackle this issue and to ensure that all Secretaries of State are liable to answer to members of the House of Commons, more must be done to overcome this issue in the future and ensure it does not become a regular occurrence?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Thank him for giving way. Another important parliamentary convention has now been observed with the intervention from the member of Strangford in the adjournment debate, and I'm very grateful for his point, and I agree very much with the points that he makes, and we'll look at all of that in a bit more detail. Most of us will be familiar with the context that he starts to describe. The Prime Minister announced that David Cameron would be appointed to the House of Lords and to serve as Foreign Secretary on Monday the 13th of November. Mr Speaker wrote to the Procedure Committee on the 22nd of November requesting that it explore options for enhanced scrutiny by the House of Commons of senior members in the House of Lords. And the Procedure Committee, of which I and some other members present are members, published its report and recommendations, and its key recommendation being that the Foreign Secretary should appear before this House to answer questions on the 17th of January 2024, and 2 months later we are still waiting for the Government's response. And as I said in my point of order last week, there have been 2 sessions of FCDO questions since that report was published, and no sign of the Foreign Secretary. In fact, there have been 3 sections of FCDO questions since his appointment, and if the usual rota continues, we could extrapolate that there ought to be another 3 sessions before summer recess. FCDO ministers have responded to 10 urgent questions, including one today, and made 8 oral statements since the new Foreign Secretary was appointed, and there have been 22 written statements from FCDO ministers in the Commons, 3 of which have been on behalf of FCDO ministers in the Lords, including one in the name of the Foreign Secretary himself. And as each question session passes, as each UQ is answered or statement is made, the accountability gap goes wider, the frustration of members of this House increases, and the absurdity of the situation becomes clearer. I'm happy to give way to my colleague from the Procedure.
Grateful to him and welcome this debate he's secured. Would he agree that, as Lord Cameron has agreed and has been reinstated, he's now doing half an hour of questions in the Lords directly to him, not other ministers? In the House of Commons, we get no minutes, no questions to the Foreign Secretary. I mean, that that can't seem right for the democratic chamber, can it?
Yes, absolutely, and this is precisely why it's important we have the opportunity to draw these points to the attention of the government today. Incidentally, I mean, I don't know if he's written it down or said it anywhere, but certainly around the time of his appointment, I think there were indications from Lord Cameron that he would be quite happy to cooperate with accountability mechanisms, but they do not seem to have been put in place, and we'll come back to that. And it's particularly important, as my honourable friend suggests, because we are living through times of significant global turmoil, perhaps some of the biggest threats to the established rules-based order of peace and security since the Second World War. And there's no guaranteed or permanent mechanism for members of this elected House as a whole to directly question and scrutinise the work of the government's chief diplomat, its roving ambassador on the world stage, its voice in the corridors of foreign powers, His Majesty's Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs, David the Right Honourable Baron Cameron of Chipping Norton. I'm happy to give way.
I'm really grateful to the honourable member bringing forward the debate tonight. Clearly, our constituents are writing to us at this time about the really challenging situation we're seeing in Gaza and clearly want answers from the person that is making decisions. The fact there is a lack of accountability in the system when there could be war crimes being committed, not least by our own country in trading arms, it is absolutely right that we should have the opportunity to scrutinise. Does he believe that we need to ensure that we have a Foreign Secretary who is elected democratically from our country and that they shouldn't be sitting in the House of Lords?
Yes, precisely. I think the key point is the accountability, and I'm going to come on to a little bit of this in more detail. The key point, I think, is the accountability to this elected House. We have been elected to hold the government to account, and we are being denied that opportunity because of decisions made by the Prime Minister. And perhaps much of this comes down to what the Prime Minister and the government wanted to achieve by the appointment of David Cameron in the first place. It might have shaken up the world of breaking news and podcast analysis for a few days. It might have signalled some kind of change in direction and priorities of the government. It might have calmed the blue wall, even if it was at the same time slightly worrying the red wall. But it also sends a very strange message to every Conservative member of this House, and perhaps every member other than the Prime Minister himself, that none of them are good enough or have the necessary skills and experience at this particular point in time to be the Foreign Secretary. And of course that applies not least to the immediately previous Foreign Secretary. He may have been redeployed to the Home Office, but is still essentially judged by the Prime Minister to be not the right person for the job. And the end result of all of this, as we've already heard in these interventions, has led to woefully inadequate opportunities for members of the Commons to effectively scrutinise the work of the Foreign Secretary and, by extension, the Foreign Office as a whole. Many of us have a huge amount of respect and regard for the Minister for International Development, and that's not something you will often hear SNP members say about Conservative ministers. But now that he has to effectively deputise for the Foreign Secretary in this House, without any additional ministerial support having been provided in the Commons team, as far as I can tell, by definition he has more to deal with than before, as it must stretch him and his team, no matter how deftly and effectively they try to work. And no matter how capable any of the ministers are, none of them can truly answer on behalf of the Foreign Secretary for the simple reason that they are not the Foreign Secretary. They won't have been in the meetings that he has been in, or been on the trips that he has been on, or attended the summits that he has attended. So all of their answers, all of their responses to questions or positions outlined in statements are second-hand at best. My honourable friend, the member for Western Bartonshire, who can't be here this evening, wrote a powerful letter to the Procedure Committee while it was considering this matter. He highlighted the ongoing situation of his constituent, Jagtar Singh Johal, arbitrarily detained by the Government of India for nearly 7 years. And I've heard from many of my own constituents who share these concerns about the treatment of Mr Johal. And my honourable friend's letter and his point of order in the House on the 10th of January drew attention to what he called the extraordinary lack of response from the Foreign Secretary to letters about this case, and his frustration at not being able to raise those concerns directly with the Foreign Secretary on the floor of this House. And such frustrations and concerns were present in other evidence taken by the committee and have been heard in other departmental questions, urgent questions, statements, points of order, even in interventions right here this evening, and indeed in Westminster Hall debates. Now, the Procedure Committee considered a range of options and possibilities for enhanced scrutiny of Lords ministers, and particularly the Secretary of State. It looked at previous suggestions of holding question sessions in Westminster Hall or one of the larger committee rooms, or convening a special grand committee, either here in the Chamber or elsewhere. But it came to the conclusion that the simplest and most straightforward way to scrutinise the Foreign Secretary would be to have him appear here in the Chamber during departmental questions, and indeed for any relevant UQs or statements, and to answer questions from the bar of the House. Now, the Hansard Society suggested in its evidence that there might be some practical and presentational issues around the presence of the Foreign Secretary standing, presumably a lectern, at the bar of the House while other ministers continue to answer questions from the dispatch box. I think the phrase used was ridiculous. And perhaps some of us would have a little bit of sympathy with that, but that shouldn't be insurmountable. And then there's the question of whether the Lords would need to give permission for one of its members to appear in the Commons, or whether the Commons would need to agree to some kind of resolution to make changes to its standing orders. But again, none of that should be insurmountable. All of these issues, starting with the actual appointment of the Foreign Secretary himself, are in the gift of the government. So ultimately, whether or not the Foreign Secretary does come to answer questions in the House, like pretty much everything else that happens here, is for the government to decide. The government can make it happen, or the government can choose not to make it happen. And by choosing not to make it happen, it will be sending a message about exactly what kind of regards it holds for this House, for the mandate we have for our constituents, and therefore for our constituents themselves. Now, we can recognise that the appointment was not totally without precedent. The Procedure Committee, and indeed the very thorough and helpful briefing from the Library on this subject, both list various examples of ministers and secretaries of state who have served in the Lords in recent and not so recent times. But that doesn't mean that those situations were not also suboptimal in terms of how those ministers were scrutinised and held to account. And there have been some attempts to distinguish between secretaries for various government departments and those that have been considered to be great offices of state. But the concept of a great office of state isn't written down anywhere, and any Prime Minister at any time could choose to change or divide the responsibilities of the Treasury or the Home Office, or indeed the FCDO, which, of course, not so long ago was the FCO, before one of the many former Prime Ministers we've had in recent years merged it with the Department for International Development. And in each case where a Secretary of State has been appointed in the Lords, whether that was Lord Mandelson as Business Secretary or Baroness Morgan as Culture Secretary, the governing party at the time said that it was all fine and there were lines of accountability to the Commons, and the official opposition at the time were suitably outraged and said this was an appalling state of affairs and it would never happen under their watch, which actually tells us quite a lot about the interchangeability of the two major political parties and the imperative on any incumbent government of whatever colour to maintain the established status quo of constitutional convention and practice. And perhaps that starts to get us to the broader points of principle that are in play here, and the broader question of whether the government and the Prime Minister, or indeed any past or future UK governments and Prime Ministers, really care all that much about scrutiny by this House and the role of the Commons more generally. The established principle in this Parliament and in the devolved institutions is that the executive is drawn from and accountable to and through the legislature. And there are plenty of examples around the world where members of the executive, the equivalent of ministers and secretaries of state, are not drawn from the legislature. In many of those cases, though, and we can think particularly of the United States, there is an incredibly thorough vetting and approval process. Appointment hearings in the United States Senate can take days or even weeks, even for relatively junior appointments. And closer to home, in Scotland's Parliament, and indeed we've seen it happen in Wales today, the appointment of the new First Minister, the appointment of Scottish Government Cabinet Secretaries and Ministers must be agreed by those legislatures, by those parliaments, before they are approved by the King. And incidentally, that includes the Lord Advocate and Solicitor General in Scotland, who are not members of the Scottish Parliament, but appear in that chamber, which is designed in order to accommodate them, so that they can sit and stand and answer questions and be held to account by the elected members of the Scottish Parliament. So a process for approval of ministers by a vote of the legislature could quite easily be adopted in this Parliament. And I think our honourable friend, the member for Perth and North Perthshire, tried to introduce something through a 10-minute rule bill in one of the previous sessions to precisely that end. And in some respects it ought to be a formality, because if the government can command a majority that accepts the Prime Minister's decisions about ministerial appointments, it should be able to get those appointments through, but at the very least it would allow some public deliberation and questioning about the wisdom of individual appointments and the relevant experience, suitability and perhaps the outside interests of ministers designate, and I'm sure there would have been questions that people might have had about the appointment of the Foreign Secretary around such outside interests. But such accountability is not something, therefore, that a government confident in its decision-making and its command of majority in the House should be afraid of. There have also been some questions about reciprocity. If ministers who are Lords are to appear before the Commons to take questions, should ministers who are MPs appear before the Lords? And on the face of it, that might not seem like an entirely unreasonable question, but it comes back to the point about accountability, and it's relevant to the intervention from the member from the Labour Party earlier. Members of the House of Lords have been appointed to their positions for the rest of their lives by the Prime Minister of the day, or in some cases because they're a bishop in the Church of England or because they're the ancestor of someone. Members of the House of Commons are accountable to their voters. Our constituents make a choice about who should represent them, and then we make representations on their behalf, not least by asking questions of government ministers. So to an extent, this comes back to the point from the member on the Labour benches, the question of whether or not the minister is elected is slightly beside the point. In this debate, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm not expecting a response from the member for Brentwood and Ongar on behalf of the people who live in his constituency. I'm putting questions on behalf of the people of Glasgow North to the government, and I'm expecting and looking forward to a response from the Parliament Secretary to the Cabinet Office. And exactly as the member said, there are huge issues in all of our constituency inbox, and none of them bigger at the moment than the situation in Israel and Gaza right now and the need for an immediate ceasefire. And yet there is no way, as we've heard, for any of us to put those views directly to the Foreign Secretary. I have no method of putting that point directly to him on the record and receive a response on behalf of the people of Glasgow North. And so that leads us not just to questions about scrutiny of Lords Ministers by the Commons, but the role and purpose of the Second Chamber, the accountability of unelected parliamentarians, the relationship between both houses, and the relationship between the legislature and the executive. And it gets back to the point that I and many others have made before, which is that meaningful reform of the Lords is not possible without meaningful reform of the Commons. A meaningful reform of the Commons would mean the government, and in particular the Prime Minister, giving up significant powers of patronage, appointment and executive control. And neither of the main parties, once they have achieved power, want to give that up. There is a reason why the Labour Party has been promising and failing to deliver meaningful reform of the House of Lords for over 100 years. Giving up the power to directly appoint members to the House of Lords would be a significant diminution of the Prime Minister's powers of patronage, and fully or even partially electing the Lords would inevitably challenge the assumed supremacy of the Commons. And the first priority of any UK government on acquiring power is to retain that power, and that will not change after the next election, no matter what the outcome is. So, the Minister will tell us all to wait patiently for the Government's official response to the Procedure Committee's report, and perhaps he'll even tell us that it will be published soon, and perhaps he'll even tell us that it will be published before recess. But we can take a pretty good guess at what it is going to say, because if the Government wanted the Foreign Secretary to appear before this House at departmental questions or at any other point, it would have already made arrangements for that to happen. Constituents in Glasgow North, who have, once upon a time, some of them been represented by the new member for Rochdale. Constituents in Glasgow North will look on this with confusion, with disappointment and increasing disenchantment. The Scottish Parliament isn't perfect, but its procedures for scrutiny of ministers and for accessibility to the wider public are light years beyond what is in place here in Westminster. Just as there's a reason that the Labour Party have repeatedly failed to reform the Lords, there is a reason why the SNP refuses to take seats in the unelected House and why it will not take seats in the unelected House. When Scotland becomes independent, perhaps there will be some kind of second chamber of Parliament, or perhaps there will be a stronger system of participative and deliberative democracy through citizens' assemblies to explore proposals before the legislature takes them forward. Whatever its shape or form, it will be decided by the people of Scotland, who are and always will be sovereign in Scotland, irrespective of the conventions and traditions of Westminster. And of course, a Foreign Secretary in an independent Scotland, certainly one with an SNP government, would work to uphold peace and human rights around the world, invest in poverty reduction and tackling climate change, and represent a country proud at last to be free of nuclear weapons of mass destruction. And the longer Westminster diverges from that vision, Madam Deputy Speaker, and that kind of transparency and accountability, the more Prime Ministers of whatever flavour, from whatever wing, of whatever party, the more they think that they can avoid scrutiny by elected parliamentarians and appoint their friends and donors and allies to positions of power without consequences, the more that people in Glasgow North and across Scotland will come to realise the difference that we can and we will make with independence.
George Galloway.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I congratulate my successor as the Member of Parliament for the most educated place in Britain. It was once said that the Glasgow Hillhead constituency had the highest pro rata subscription rate to the New Statesman of any constituency in the land, and he showed it in the erudition, albeit of an rather ruritarian state of affairs in his contribution, and I'm grateful to him for tabling this and for giving me time that might otherwise have been appropriated by him to make this contribution. Some chicken, some neck, as Mr. Churchill famously said. To paraphrase Mr. Churchill, some Secretary of State, some time. This is not comparable to Peter Mandelson being the business secretary in the House of Lords. This is a time of great international peril, where foreign affairs is undoubtedly the biggest single item in our inboxes. Must be true. There are millions on the streets. Well, it's certainly true of my inbox. There are millions on the streets about Britain's foreign policy. There are demonstrations daily, weekly, all over the country. People are seized of our role in international affairs in a way that, for someone like me, there can't be many members in the House who have participated in more foreign policy issues from the 1980s until now. I have never known a time like it, when our people were so occupied, indeed many preoccupied, by our role in the world. And what I'm about to say is in no sense disrespect for the current occupant of the Foreign Secretaryship. Quite the contrary. He's a big improvement on his predecessor. He's a cut above his likely successor. I don't demur at all from the idea that Lord Cameron is a skilled international diplomat. Our problem is, as a country, who are forever lecturing other people on the quality of their democracy, now have an unelected head of state, an unelected prime minister, and an unelected foreign secretary, the second most important piece on the Treasury bench. And that's ruritarian. It's actually rather absurd if you start to consider it. As the Honourable Gentleman for Glasgow North was adumbrating the possible outcomes of a lectern being erected just at that white line there, so that we could all, and the microphones would need to be adjusted, face that way instead of, Madam Deputy Speaker, facing towards you. That's ridiculous. If there was a will, there would be a way. The silence from the government in response to the procedure committee's beseeching of them to find a solution to this is eloquent, as such lengthy silences always are. We have a situation where daily, if not hourly, new and dramatic foreign policy developments are occurring. Just this day, for example, Prime Minister Netanyahu announced that this port that's being built in Gaza, with the rubble of the homes destroyed in the bombing, including the skulls and the bones of the people destroyed with the houses and lying unburied under the rubble, that according to Netanyahu, this port is being built for the deportation of millions of Palestinians from the territory, an act of ethnic cleansing of the foulest kind. We would have expected a statement from the Foreign Secretary in the light of such a dramatic development. But statement came there none, and could come there none. His able deputy, and I share the honourable gentleman's feelings for the Minister of State, a fine man, I've known him a very long time. He cannot possibly cope with all of this workload as effectively Lord Cameron's deputy in here, his vicar on earth in here. But even if he could, he still would not be the Foreign Secretary. We cannot continue to be a democratic country. We cannot continue. Of course.
I think sorry, of course.
I will be brief because it is very unusual to come in after an adjournment debate has started and then intervene. And it is important that everybody who does intervene stays to the end as well.
Deputy Speaker, and thank you for that strict reminder. Does the honourable gentleman agree that if he or I was to secure an urgent question, the same principle would apply? The Foreign Secretary would not be here.
Indeed, cannot be here for reasons which are what? About architecture? Kindly guide me with your eyebrows as you normally do, Madam Deputy Speaker, if I am going on too long. I'm not entirely sure about the timings of all of this. But as a matter of architecture, for a democratic chamber to be bereft of the presence of its principal diplomat, the country's principal diplomat, at a time of massive international tension, is completely absurd. Madam Deputy Speaker, for those of us on this day in 2003, our country went off to the most disastrous war that we fought for well over 100 years. It was a disastrous decision. But at least it was a decision that the Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary of the day were ready to and had to defend each and every single day. The debates, not many of us here now were involved in them, except thee and me. These debates were of the fiercest and most urgent kind. But we may be on the brink of World War III, Madam Deputy Speaker. Little Macron may be about to march his legionnaires into Odessa, creating the gravest international crisis since the Second World War. And we will not be able to question our Foreign Secretary about it. We'll have to wait for the morning editions to learn what the government intends to do about it. War in Ukraine, war in Gaza, maybe war against Iran, war in the Red Sea, war everywhere. Foreign Secretary, nowhere. Nowhere, at least, that he can be questioned by the people in this country who are elected to question him. That's the point, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is our duty to hold ministers to account. But by definition, in this situation, we cannot hold the occupant. We talk about great offices of state. At such a period of high tension, there can be no doubt that the second most important office of state in Britain today is the Foreign Secretary, but he is out with our reach. We can't even, as we once did, rub shoulders with them in the division lobby. We can't even see him in the members' tea room. We can't bump into him in the corridor here. We cannot in any way impress upon him that millions upon millions of our fellow citizens and our constituents have this or that concern, point of view on the great issues of the day. This is untenable, Madam Deputy Speaker. I am seeking to inject some note of urgency and passion into this because it is an untenable situation. I wish that from amongst the members opposite it had been possible to find one capable of being the Foreign Secretary. Would have been much easier and this debate would not be happening. That was not so. None of them were up to the job. It's therefore incumbent immediately for the government to bring forward a solution whereby we are able to look in the eyes of the second most important politician in the state and press upon him the political preoccupations that occupy the concerns of millions of us.
Nigel Mills.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to follow the honourable gentleman. And although I kind of agree with every word he said, I'm not sure I would ever be in a position to say that. I just rise to make a few observations really about the Procedure Committee report, which was not an easy one because I don't think any of us came to this place with the idea that we would willingly invite members of the House of Lords to come and sit on these green benches and address us. And I don't think any of us want to accidentally encourage this government or future ones to appoint more senior Secretaries of State in the House of Lords because they can get away with it and we can find a way of a little bit of accountability and that makes it all right. But the simple fact was that what the government did was appoint the second most important member of the government as somebody from the House of Lords at probably the most dangerous time in the world in my adult lifetime, resulting in a position where we can't question him, we can't try and impress on him with our views before he goes around the world, and we can't hear back from him what he's said when he's been to all these meetings. And I actually think the appointment of Lord Cameron was a very good one. I think he is an incredibly able politician. From the look of it, he's been working incredibly hard to represent our national interests around the world. So I'm not going to criticise the individual who's been appointed in that situation. But surely the government can see that this is not a tolerable situation for the elected House to be placed in. And what we were trying to do as a committee was come up with some sort of solution that gave us some little bit of accountability, accepting we could not find a perfect solution. Now, we started from the point of our predecessor committee on the appointments of Lord Mandelson and Lord Adonis back in 2009, who recommended question sessions in Westminster Hall every couple of months. But the problem we had with that was Westminster Hall isn't big enough. And if Lord Cameron was to appear in Westminster Hall answering questions about generally foreign affairs or even on a single topic, we might find that there were substantially more MPs wanting to ask questions in Westminster Hall than could possibly be safely accommodated. That would equally apply to any committee room in this place. And then we'd have to have worked out, will we be having balloted questions in advance, which isn't generally done in Westminster Hall. We would have to have put in place a whole load of arrangements that we've never done before for the relatively short time left of this Parliament. Now, I hope that Lord Cameron is Foreign Secretary for a long time, and these arrangements would have been needed for a lot longer. But if you rule out Westminster Hall and you rule out any committee room, the only thing you're left with is doing it in the House of Commons chamber. I don't think we had general support for the idea of having a member of the House of Lords actually physically sat on a green bench addressing the House in a dispatch box. I don't think there's a great deal of precedent for that, which really only left the bar of the House as a place to do it. We even talked about the idea of Lord Cameron beaming in from that screen like President Zelensky did, or like Boris Johnson did as Prime Minister when he was doing PMQs when he had COVID. But I mean, that would have been imperfect as well, not to have him in person here so we could look him in the white of the eye. So if you believe that this House should have some level of scrutiny of the Foreign Secretary, there is no alternative for it to be in here. And we came up with the least bad option was the bar of the House. Now, we would not have any problem if the government said, no, let's have him on that bench, let's have him in the dispatch box, let's do that. And then equally imperfect is to have him here for general Foreign Office questions. We could have recommended that he come here for a dedicated half-hour question time like he does in the House of Lords. The problem is that would then give the one Secretary of State in the House of Lords kind of like greater accountability in the House of Commons, because he'd be answering questions for a whole half an hour a month, whereas actually any other head of department probably only answers a handful of those questions in their half-hour hourly question time. So we may actually then be having more scrutiny over the Secretary of State in the Lords than in the Commons. So that wouldn't be perfect either. So I think all the options we have here are terrible, But this was not the starting point of the committee or the House. This was the position we were put in by the government, and we were trying to find the least bad way of fixing it. So I hope the Minister, when he responds to this debate, doesn't resort to nitpicking about individual ideas. I hope he engages with the general principle of, if the government chooses, of its own volition, to have one of the great offices of state held by somebody not in the House of Commons, should there be a chance on a regular basis for the House of Commons to have some scrutiny of that individual, so we can question them on what they've done, we can try and impress upon the overall views of the House that he can represent those around the world? Or should we just leave it and just accept that, well, that's the way it's always been, and we don't have ministers of the Lords appearing in this chamber? I think the balance clearly here, if you have somebody of that seniority dealing with the level of importance of issues that we are at the moment, we have to find some way forward in this situation. And I would certainly echo, I have a very great regard for the Minister of State for Development and Africa, but the best one in the world, he's not the Foreign Secretary, and some of these big issues we do need to be able to question the Foreign Secretary. So hopefully the Minister will come up with some good news that the government has come up with a preferred way that can work, and we can get on with this rapidly. I think that is what a modern democratic parliament has every right to expect, that if we're going to have ministers in senior positions who aren't actually members of this House, we find a way of scrutinising them, as is done by nearly every parliament around the world that appoints ministers not from that chamber. They find a way to do this. This is not rocket science. It is not without precedent. We can find a way of doing it. Let's get on and do it.
Minister Alex Burghart.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and congratulate the honourable gentleman from Glasgow North on bringing forward what is genuinely a very interesting debate and a surprisingly well attended adjournment debate. I think the best attended adjournment debate that I've taken in some time. Were I in mischievous mood, Madam Deputy Speaker, I would gently refer him to the answers that I gave him on the 18th of November, on the 29th of February and on the 12th of March, and resume my place. But alas, mischief eludes me, and I will give him as full an answer as I can, because obviously the government is considering the report of the Procedure Committee, a very good and serious report that looked into this, if not anomalous situation, because it's arisen before, a situation that it's quite right that we consider in a modern light. And in the meantime, whilst we're waiting for the government's full consideration, there are a number of ways in which the Foreign Secretary is being held to account by Parliament as a whole. In the House of Lords, he answered questions on the 21st of November, on the 5th of December, on the 15th of January, 16th of January, 13th of February, 15th of March, and the 12th of March. Now, I know that the House of Lords is not a place where the SNP go to play. As he knows, because we've debated this on a number of occasions, I think it's a great shame. And I understand that they have plans, the vision to break up the kingdom failed, I'm pleased to say, with the support of the Scottish people. And I think after that juncture, they would have done well to accept that, given that it was a once-in-a-generation vote and that they were all plausibly going to be here for some time if people continue to elect SNP members of the House, then it would have been wise for them to see if they could stick a few people in the upper house so that the views of their party and that part of the electorate could be represented in that part of Parliament. They chose not to, and consequently they're not currently able to question the Foreign Secretary when he is standing to answer questions in the Lords. But that is their prerogative. I'll happily give way to the Honourable Lady.
I'm grateful to the Minister giving way, because he will know that our constituents' voices will not be heard in the other place. It is us which are elected to bring those voices forward. On the 17th of October, the Foreign Secretary at the time invited all members of the House over to the Foreign Office to answer questions. Could he explain why the Foreign Secretary hasn't made himself available, even in an informal way, off the record, so that members of Parliament from the House of Commons can scrutinise him over his decision-making?
Minister.
Well, she'll have an opportunity to ask that question of the Foreign Secretary's colleagues when they next come to the House. Because I can't answer the particulars because they're due to the Foreign, they pertain to the Foreign Office. And as has been raised by several members, again, in the meantime, there is the opportunity to ask questions of my right honourable friend from Sutton Coldfield. And whilst it's true he's not the Foreign Secretary, he is in the Cabinet, and he is bound by collective agreement. He sits in the discussions that are held at the highest level on all matters, but also on foreign affairs. And he's answered questions in this House on the 14th of November, the 21st of November, the 27th of November, the 7th of December, the 11th of December, the 12th of December, the 19th of December, the 8th of January, the 10th of January, the 24th of January, the 26th of January, 29th of January, 30th of January, 21st of February, 27th of February, 28th of February, 12th of March, and the 19th of March. And so the members of this House have had an opportunity to ask questions of him, a man who sits in Cabinet. So sorry, Madam Deputy Speaker. A man who sits in Cabinet and knows the Foreign Secretary's mind. I'm sure that he will be very grateful for the honourable gentleman's comments about his workload. But I can assure the honourable gentleman that he's a very capable individual, as honourable gentleman from Rochdale pointed out, and workload is not a problem that he suffers from. But it's also, again, whilst we're waiting for the government's response to the report, it's also possible for members of this House to write to the Foreign Secretary. I know the honourable gentleman has, I believe once, and I assume that having done so, he has asked the Foreign Secretary all the questions that he'd like to ask him. If he hasn't, he's welcome to write a second letter. There is, of course, a broader point, and a point that I raised with the honourable gentleman, with my honourable friend from Amber Valley, when I was in front of the Select Committee. And that is that there actually is a historical dimension to this, which I think works with the grain of what the Select Committee is saying. That this first arose, Madam Deputy Speaker, as you will probably know, in 1674, when I can see from your face you remember the incident well from your history lessons. And it was in 1674 that the Commons chose to admonish two peers, the Duke of Buckingham and the Earl of Arlington, and they summoned them to the House. Summoned to the House of Commons to answer questions. The first, because I think the Duke of Buckingham was considered to be lascivious in his lifestyle, wicked and scandalous, and the Earl of Arlington because he favoured papists. And they were admonished by the Commons and sent on their way. And the Lords' response to this was to point out that their House too had privileges, and that it was not within the power of the Commons to forcibly summon members of the Lords to the bar of the House. And they passed a standing order, Lord's standing order, that said that members of the House of Lords could not be summoned here. However, it was still clear from that members of the House of Lords could be invited. And that members of the House of Lords could be invited. And there have been a number of instances where members of the Lords have been invited to this House and have answered questions. In 1779, the Earl of Belcaris and Earl Colden-Wallace were brought here to answer questions about the Army's conduct during the American Revolution. In 1805, Lord Melville came to this House, having been impeached by it. And he did so on his own request. He asked that the House gave him an audience. Lord Tynemouth was questioned twice about Indian affairs in 1806 and 1813. And more famously, the Duke of Wellington came to give an account of the Peninsular War in 1814. Now, I raise these points because we're all aware that there have been moments in not so recent history when commoners have come to the bar. 1957 was the last time Mr. Juna was summoned over an issue in the press. My point is that if the Commons wants to, it's capable of inviting a member of the Lords to come and answer questions here. And to a certain extent, history places the solution at his disposal. The Commons could invite the Foreign Secretary now to come to the bar of the House and answer questions. However, I appreciate that he is looking for something more routine, and for that, I'm afraid he will have to wait until the government responds to the report. But in conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, it is right that we have this debate. It is important that there is scrutiny of the government. It is important that there is scrutiny of the Cabinet, and that is what this government seeks to provide.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. All those in favour say aye. Aye. The ayes have it. Order. Order.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.